I'd like to thank everybody for being with us today. There is a lot of coverage. The genesis of this conversation stems from several sources. One is it appeared to us that the information about what was going on in Canada and the truckers' convoy, as some have called it, was fragmented and maybe a little bit slanted based on the source of the information. And so we thought it would be very, very useful to present a clear-headed view from three experts on this theme and other themes related to Canada, so that folks outside of Canada, even though there's many in Canada who are listening to us today, and we welcome you, could get a clearer vision of what it is. And it was also response to a number of requests from our stakeholders throughout Latin America, precisely for this kind of a conversation. We have been waiting a few weeks to do this based on trying to figure out when would be the most opportune time. Clearly, the events in the world now don't necessarily make this the most opportune time, or to the extent that we're going to be talking a little bit about RT's extensive tweeting about the convoy. Maybe it does make it a little bit more relevant to the events going on right now in our world. This event will be conducted, as I said, in English. It will be recorded in English and Spanish, will be available on our website by this evening, I would imagine, at ccacanada.com. The other point I would like to raise before we start is that our partner for this event is Bob Ramsey and Ramsey Talks, based in Toronto. We thank Bob and his team again for facilitating this event and helping us spread the word amongst his vast distribution list. So thank you to them once again. We want to get right to the panelists. We're very, very pleased today to have Álvaro Caso, who's resident in Ottawa, a former professor at the University of Colorado. He's a historian, now a visiting scholar at the Johns Hopkins University, and a researcher at ANII in Uruguay. Álvaro, thank you for being with us today. Andrew Coyne, based in Toronto, a columnist for the Globe and Mail, one of the leading columnists in Canada, I might add. Thank you, Andrew. And Judy Trinh, CBC investigative reporter, based in Ottawa, and I say without fear of contradiction, probably the most knowledgeable on-the-ground reporter during this whole episode, and the aftermath of it as well. So without further ado, let's jump straight. Oh, one other housekeeping detail. We will and be pleased to take written questions. If everybody knows how to fill in the question and answer box, please keep them brief. Please try not to put them in a form of a diatribe, because it's really hard to parse the words to come up with a question when it's a diatribe. So and we will do our best to integrate them into the conversation as we go along. Okay, now I think I've taken care of all of the housekeeping details. So with that, let me first ask Judy to talk a bit about the origins of this convoy. Who were the people who organized it? What were the stated grievance and goals, and how did this whole thing develop? Judy, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you, Kenneth. I think this protest began as a protest against vaccine mandates, specifically by truckers who did, but it was a small amount of truckers because only 10% of Canada's truckers are unvaccinated. But this is a vocal group with big machinery. So what ended up happening was they were angry with the vaccine mandates. And then there was a group who were also angry with all COVID restrictions in general. They did not like mask policies. They did not like government lockdowns that were imposed, social distancing rules. And there was also a anti-government bent to this group. They were predominantly based in Western Canada, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and they basically co-opted this truckers' protest and organized it and turned it into their own. So they went to Ottawa under the guise that they were going to Parliament Hill to protest the vaccine mandate for truckers, but it was much more than that. Their ulterior motives were dark, were conspiratorial. Organizers, the key organizers in this group, wanted to basically trigger an election, overthrow the government in not so, I guess in the most blatant terms, that's what they wanted to do. They had a very faulty sense of how the democratic process worked. They felt that if they had the numbers, that they could trigger this. And what is interesting is by the use of the trucks, they were able to draw a lot of attention, because when you are able to move thousands of vehicles into the Ottawa, into the capital of Canada, and just park it on the streets, that is your weapon. That is also your tool. It's an immovable object, literally. So what happened that first weekend was the intelligence that police received. They were told that these truckers were coming to Ottawa and that they would only stay for 3 days. So January 28th, that weekend, they would only stay for 3 days, at which point they would all leave. But of course, that was not their intention at all. They wanted to stay and they wanted to occupy the city and basically demand a regime change. What is interesting is when they arrived in Ottawa, the police intelligence was so concerned that a similar case to the Capitol riots in Washington would happen. They were worried about outright violence, and that's what they prepared for. So when you listen to the news conferences by the police chief in the days after that first weekend, he kept on calling it a success. And the reason why he would call it a success was because there was not this violence. We did not have individuals try to barge into Parliament Hill, vandalize the House of Commons. They basically remained on the streets, but what they did do was that they terrorized the public, the residents of Ottawa. And I think that is the difference, because it wasn't an outright act that was criminal. It was an act that lasted more than 3 weeks, that was a psychological almost, and a mental terror, in the sense that they would not leave. Residents felt trapped in their homes, yet the powers, the authorities who were supposed to protect them, which were just down the street, Parliament Hill, you had the provincial government, you had City Hall, you had police. The authorities who were supposed to maintain law and order were not doing it, and were allowing what was flagrant flouting of the law by a group that was predominantly white Canadians. And I think that is, and Andrew and Álvaro, you might disagree with me on this, but I think that was actually a very undercovered aspect of this protest, that it was driven by white privilege, that individuals, if this was a protest that was conducted by Black Lives Matter or Indigenous individuals, it would have been shut down much earlier. They would never have been allowed to drive heavy trucks into the city in any way.
I actually
So at the
agree
height
with
of
that.
it, that first weekend, we had 8,000 Freedom Convoy protesters in the city. As the weekend grew, Saturday and Sunday, the crowds grew to approximately 15,000. But some of these were just people who were curious. But the official number is that approximately 8,000 Freedom Convoy protesters were in the city, along with thousands of their heavy trucks and vehicles.
Thank you, Judy. I know what you mentioned, but so I'll come to you in a second with Andrew, Judy, and actually invoked your name, which is great. So it's a great segue. So first of all, and the comments on anything that Judy said, but let me also preface it by saying the concept of how this was handled based on the composition of the protesters. We do know there are videos available of several of the main protesters involved in diatribes, basically anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, anti-Asian, et cetera, et cetera. So they're at the core of the organizer, there's there's a base of that. So maybe you could integrate that concept into your response to what Judy was saying.
Yeah, a slight difference in emphasis, but basically in accord with what Judy's saying. But I would say this thing was only tangentially related to truckers or vaccine mandates for truckers. I think that was entirely a pretext. The operative word being trucks. That the people organizing this, and as you mentioned, some of them have kind of QAnon style relations to reality, certainly in their understanding of and appreciation for democratic government. Some had overtly white supremacist views on the world, broadly anti-government in a cartoonishly libertarian at best, and nihilistically anarchist at worst. General disaffection, not just with vaccine mandates or with all of the panoply of controls that we've all had to endure during the pandemic, but with society, life, government, it's hard to credit it with any kind of coherent philosophy or ideology. It's mostly nihilism. And it emerges as a kind of a populist thing because it gets harnessed into a kind of a class war of the smarty pants versus the rest of us, the people who think they know better than us and the rest of us, the elites and the people, these kinds of populist dichotomies. And that there's a lot of that out there, and there's a deep roots to that, and there's a lot of blame that can be assigned in various directions for that, but it exists, and we've seen various people harnessing that in various ways. We saw Donald Trump harnessing it, and obviously there's a lot of links here, overt and theoretical, between this and the Trump movement in the States. But we saw, long before that, we saw Rob Ford, the famous mayor of Toronto, was harnessing that same kind of antipathy. So it's out there. The people who organized this thing have been trying to do similar things before. We'd had a couple of years ago in Canada, we had the United We Roll thing, which had a lot of similarities. It had some of the same populism, some of the same racist elements in it, and the use of the trucker motif and the trucks as obstacles and blockades, as Judy was saying. And you only take a few trucks. I'm surprised to hear that there were thousands of trucks. I'd been hearing more like hundreds, but I'll defer to Judy's knowledge on that. But it only takes a few trucks to cause as much havoc as it does hundreds of thousands of people marching through the streets when you have a genuine popular movement. And so people have been doing this in other countries at various times. And so this idea was kind of out there in the air. And when the particular issue of the trucker vaccine mandates blew up, I think they all saw their opportunity, that they could get in there and take their existing ideological or ambitions of whatever kind, and the particular mechanism of the trucks, and then tie all that together with trucks and vaccine mandates and everyone's fatigue with the pandemic and everything else. So it was a kind of a toxic brew there that all came together. So I think, as I say, as far as the organizers were concerned, this was never really about vaccines or vaccine mandates or truckers. They were able to get people who were upset about those things to come in on that for their various reasons. And a lot of people who don't really understand how democracy works, et cetera. And they seemed to take the police by surprise. Judy's right that there was some sort of thing about this would only be a 3-day thing, but there was stuff on social media that all of us were reading, and news stories where they were saying, we're going to stay as long as we have to stay until, and their specific aim outlined in their memorandum of understanding was that the Governor General of Canada, who for people not from Canada should understand is a purely figurehead position as the representative of the Crown, but the Governor General of Canada and the appointed Senate of Canada, and I'm not even going to try to explain that to people not from Canada, but that the Governor General and the Senate and the members of this organizing committee would basically govern Canada by decree for a while. I'm not sure how long they intended, but enough so they could dismantle all the anti-COVID measures. So there was some fairly explicit statements out there that they were basically going to hold the city of Ottawa hostage. So I try to give people the benefit of the doubt on the policing side. I know it's a really tough job, and this was a really tough thing. And so after it had all taken root, I understand why there was a lot of caution. To some extent, I understand why there was some caution in trying to approach it, because there was certainly a lot of talk about the potential for violence. But why they were allowed to come in and set up shop and get themselves entrenched and dug in, and with infrastructure and supply lines and eventually saunas and hot tubs, is really quite remarkable. And once that had taken root, once they had got themselves so dug in, then we just had an enormous problem in our hands. And I should probably leave it at that, because we'll discuss how the response, how it was responded to later.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, we will move to the Emergencies Act shortly. I want to bring in Álvaro to this as well. Álvaro, Andrew had mentioned, I think, and Judy also, the foreign influences on this, right? And I think it's been shown, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the biggest supporter and tweeter and disseminator of information about this outside of Canada was RT News in Russia. So bringing it all back home to what's going on now, as well as I understand, Fox News was maybe the second biggest promotion outlet for this. Do you want to talk a little bit, Álvaro, about those international linkages to this? And as we know, a big supporter in Latin America was the president of Brazil, Bolsonaro.
Yes. Well, first of all, let me reiterate my gratitude to Ken, and I'm very honored to be with Judy and Andrew, to whom I regularly listen on the CBC. And so, yeah, I think that this kind of international dimension cannot be underestimated. But I mean, I think that there's been a little bit of a debate on Canadian media, and particularly on progressive media, about how making this a wholly foreign event also kind of runs against the type of dynamics that Judy was mentioning, of kind of homegrown radicalization out in the West, white supremacy, etc. That has taken root domestically, we may say, albeit it's definitely connected with what's been happening in the US since 2016 or 2015, etc., or has gained a lot more visibility since those years. I was very surprised, I must say. I went on Latin American media basically, I think 10 days after the encampment had basically been set up in Ottawa. And I was very surprised at the kind of vitriolic reaction that a kind of very, matter-of-factly intervention that I made, basically laying out the facts of what was going on, had on social media. I'm a historian. I'm kind of typically veer away from attention, or from hot takes, right? Or I typically try to speak in full paragraphs and not in just one-liners. And I was very surprised to see, a lot of comment in Spanish. Some of it coming from fellow people from Latin American origin who are here now in Canada. Others from who were in Latin America ostensibly, supporting the convoy, replicating some of the same tropes about, authoritarianism, infused, of COVID, kind of creating a police state through the vaccine mandates, or through the vaccine passports, or the mask mandates, or whatever, replicating this kind of tropes, and also replicating this kind of as Andrew was perfectly articulating, this kind of anarcho-libertarian views that are now also taking a lot of hold in Latin America, and that are having a lot of energy in countries like Brazil, like Argentina. We saw a little bit of that in Chile as well in the last election. This kind of presenting elections in Latin America as great contests between quote unquote freedom, libertad, and whatever it's on the other side, right? And I thought that was very interesting how this movement that was happening, thousands of kilometers away in a country that is well known for its, welfare state, it's sort of social cohesion, like Canada, that is known like that in Latin America, was actually garnering the attention of people who domestically, perhaps in Latin America, want to, are hearkening back to, or want to enact a mode of politics that is, very much akin to what Bolsonaro in some ways enacted in Brazil, or what Trump enacted in the US. And a lot of it, I would agree absolutely with that, with what Andrew said in terms of like, the kind of the rhetorical and political analysis of like, a lot of it, a lot of the comments that I personally got were also, as an academic, right, very anti-elite, right? It's like, oh, you're part of kind of this group thing of like, left wing, whatever, like academics who want to tell us, who want to tell us what to do, etc. Right? So in Spanish, even the term woke, right, which has been mobilized a lot by the right here. We just had CPAC in Orlando with kind of like an anti-woke, quote unquote, method, sort of like theme. It's even getting in Spanish, which there's no literally a translation in Spanish for woke, like something similar to what's happening in Quebec too, right? With that controversy between the premier and Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois, and but so you hear you hear Spanish speakers talking about anti-wokeness, right? And so all these other things that are also trickling into Latin American politics. And to me, one of the challenges of this is like, what is driving this, right? Is it like, are people driving this? Are bots driving this? How are political elites actually reacting to this? It's, to me, one of the big unknowns of the era we're entering in, or we're actually sort of like amidst in this place right now.
If I could just pick up on that,
Please.
just as the organizers were basically exploiting their followers in this protest, a lot of other people started to exploit the protests from outside. At its best, it was people who were romanticizing it, attributing this to being a working class uprising, for example, when it was only a fraction of truckers. That most of the people there weren't truckers. Most truckers have nothing to do with this. They didn't represent truckers. They certainly didn't represent the working class, or as I sometimes saw it, the people of Canada. So people would invest it with a much greater significance than it actually had. Sometimes, as I say, out of lack of knowledge of exactly who and what was involved. Sometimes opportunistically, maybe unconsciously opportunistically, where people ascribe motives and ideologies to whatever is going on that suits their interests. So if you are upset with this or that policy of the government, then you say, well, that's what these people are protesting against. And then sometimes it's just out and out cynical manipulation. There's certainly a movement on the right, and not just on the far right. And let's put it this way: there's a legitimate version of this, which is that some conservatives are very eager to try to win working class votes, and they should be, and that's great. And they see an opening in that the left, as they would say, has become much more obsessed with identity politics issues and has left behind traditional working class issues. And so now the conservative movement, by being anti-woke, can actually go and try and win these working class votes. All of that is well and good. That's democratic politics. But you saw people trying to play that game with this protest, and painting anybody who had any concerns or objections to it as essentially being anti-working class, elitist snobs, etc. And that's pretty poisonous. And a lot of people who should have known better in the media and in politics were playing that kind of game. But as I say, it became a vehicle for all kinds of different, if you were upset with Justin Trudeau's government for any reason, you could kind of pack that into this protest. And but you had to, in the process, overlook some pretty despicable things that were going on. People have to understand, and a lot of people outside the country don't understand, this was not a peaceful protest, unless we define peaceful as meaning you're not actually murdering people or breaking bones, etc. But there are hundreds and hundreds of accounts from Ottawans about being intimidated, being threatened, in some cases being actually assaulted, beyond the inconvenience and the pain, almost literally pain, of the nonstop honking of the horns, etc., beyond just the frightening thing of having your city taken over in this way. This was not peaceful protest. This was certainly not civil disobedience. And again, there's that romanticization going on that people who actually were there and on the ground and dealing with these people had a very different account of. But if you only looked at some of the video clips that the protesters and their media enablers were sharing online, it was all about bouncy castles and face painting and people dancing. So they had these kind of jolly looking visuals that they could spread around and say, look, here's the supposed threat. And meanwhile, out of range of the cameras, in ordinary, individual encounters, people were being terrorized. And so again, they were, if you're not familiar with that, if you're not actually paying attention, and comes up so often in democratic politics, that people have to pay attention. If you weren't familiar with the granular details, you could have a very different impression of what was actually going on in Ottawa.
That's a very good
Thank
point,
you,
Andrew.
Trinh.
I think that is something that the media, in my opinion, could have done a much better job at right at the beginning. We could have illuminated those darker aspects behind these protesters, the organizers, and we didn't do that till further on into like the second week was when we started talking about the xenophobia, the anti-Semitism. We started digging up those racist and xenophobic posts on social media that the organizers had. That could have come out front and center. And I think that if media reporting had treated that more prominently, that in terms of the individuals who were drawn to this message of lifting COVID restrictions or anti-COVID vaccine mandates or anti-mandate period, individuals who were possibly swayed may have thought, given it a second thought. I do know, and the troubling thing for my own reporting is that despite knowing that there are these darker elements, despite knowing that the organizers had this past, there was still an element of a quote unquote regular population or your typical citizen who still wanted to support this. When I was at the Coventry camp, which was the main supply camp, in which basically they would have trucks unloading equipment, fuel, and food, and then they would distribute it into smaller vehicles and then drive them downtown to the protesters. What I noticed in that camp was locals, a high number of local residents who would come and offer individuals access to their homes to give them a shower, so they could have a shower, who would donate food. I noticed individuals, students from McGill would come in and they were vaccinated, but they were really upset that they had to be vaccinated. They felt that it was an affront to their rights, and that's why they were joining in the protests. So there is this element of people, citizens who wanted to support it, but whether or not they are aware of, I think this is up for debate. Can you support this protest knowing that they are xenophobic? Can you divorce that? And I don't think you can divorce that at all. And people, when they join in, they believe that they are just supporting one aspect of it. And the other thing that was made worse, Andrew, as you were saying, there was this permissive attitude. Like, we showed the bouncy castles, we showed the hot tubs because it was so surreal. But the things that we perhaps did not show enough of was we didn't show the Nazi symbols that were on the Canadian flags that we saw. We didn't show the yellow stars that these anti-mandate people were wearing because they felt that they were being persecuted. So we needed to show that aspect of it. On the second weekend, the first weekend you had the hate symbols. On the second weekend, you had more hate symbols, but you also had a panoply of conspiratorial individuals show up. There was a woman who declared herself the Queen of Canada, holding court in front of hundreds of people on Parliament Hill, which is just a ridiculous sight. There was a man on a horse in a cowboy hat carrying a Trump 2024 flag, right? We didn't necessarily show that on television. What I think that you saw on Twitter was perhaps a more realistic sense of what was going on. But in terms of overall media coverage, we weren't showing that aspect of it. And you're right, Andrew, it was not a peaceful protest. They were very good. And this is when I wrote my article about military and police influence, one of the things that I was thinking about was how they were very good at walking this very fine line. they would break bylaws. So, in police thinking, or they were kind of lower tiered laws, still illegal, but they were not doing anything outright violent. There was no vandalism, or there was no assault that were initially reported. Then we find out that there were cases, but police were telling the people who were calling 911 that they were too busy dealing with the protests to handle these calls. So what ended up happening was individuals felt that they were on their own. And I think if there is any silver lining to be taken from this, it is the resolve of regular citizens to try to affect change on their own. On that second weekend, citizens were so upset that police were not stopping the protesters from distributing fuel, that they actually disrupted the protest on their own. They actually waded into traffic, blocking the convoy from coming downtown. So they ended up blocking dozens of vehicles from driving from the supply camp to downtown Ottawa to participate in the protest. And that, I think, is the takeaway, in the sense that in a time when Canadians were losing trust in their institutions, they at least found strength within themselves to do something. And we have some hard questions to answer. We have to look at the issues of accountability. That goes back to that question. Was there faulty intelligence? Why were the trucks allowed? Why was a permissive attitude allowed by police? Why did they not? They said they would ticket. They said they would stop the fuel deliveries. They had one raid. And after they raided Coventry Road, then the next day there was no police presence. Some things don't make sense. What was driving their decisions? And someone should be held accountable. When you talk about this, Andrew and Álvaro, it is systemic issues at play here. But at the same time, individuals should be held accountable. Right now, the two individuals who are being, I guess, being held to account in any way is Ottawa's first Black police chief and Ottawa's first woman chair of the Police Services Board. And that in itself is a question of whether or not they are being scapegoated, because it is much more than an issue of those two individuals.
Thank you, Judy. We haven't even touched on the blockade of the Ambassador Bridge or the interdiction of shipment of arms coming in throughout Coutts, Alberta from the United States. More to get into, but I want to hold that in abeyance, or just maybe permanently park it on the side given time constraints. I want to get to the second international, we might say, flashpoint that garnered a lot of attention throughout the world. The first one being the actual convoy and what was going on. The second one was how the government ultimately handled the matter with the invocation of the Emergencies Act. And Andrew, maybe you could talk a little bit about the choices that the government had, a bit about the Emergencies Act, what it allows the government to do, what the government did do, and what the government didn't do, even though they theoretically could have, if it wanted to exercise all the powers they had. And then I want to go to Álvaro and ask him about, compared to what he's seen in Latin America, or certainly many of the tweets and reactions he's gotten comparing what the Canadian government did to what Nicolas Maduro has been doing in Venezuela. I think it's important to have the juxtaposition of what actually happened versus what people may have happened. So, yeah. Andrew, could you help us with that?
Sure. Well, the context, just to repeat what you're saying, is not just this 3-week-long blockade in Ottawa that showed no signs of ending, in which there was a hardcore within that movement that no one knew quite what they intended or what they were prepared to do. The mushrooming of other blockades around the country, including at the Ambassador Bridge, with the potential for more of these, and the seeming inability of the police, particularly in Ottawa, to deal with this. Now, the police did deal with the blockades elsewhere, but the one in Ottawa had become so entrenched that no one seemed to know what to do, or certainly weren't doing. so again, to repeat the point I made before, it's the fact that they allowed them to get so entrenched that was really the nub of the issue. The argument has been made that the police already had the powers they needed within existing and ordinary police procedures to clear them out. But again, I say the fact of the matter is whether they had those powers or not, they weren't using them and nothing was getting done. The Emergencies Act has a name that sounds like something really scary. It replaced something that was really quite sweeping, was called the War Measures Act, which had been used in the past in Canada and had been viewed as being a far too blunt instrument and had done real damage to civil liberties, et cetera. So the Emergencies Act, the whole point of it was to replace the War Measures Act with something much more constrained. And this has to be understood outside Canada. This was not martial law. This was not the suspension of civil liberties. This was not emergency, states of emergencies as they might be understood in some other countries. This gave a modest increase in powers. There's a specific set of things that are laid out in the act of the kinds of things the police will be able to do. For example, to designate a certain area as a protected area, to be able to commandeer service providers, tow truck operators, or more arguably financial service providers to aid the police in dealing with a state of emergency. They're quite delimited. They're quite modest. They're all subject to the Charter of Rights, which is our Bill of Rights, like the United States. The emergency has to be approved by Parliament, and remember, we have a government here that has a minority of seats in the Parliament. So, in order for the emergency to last beyond the first few days, it had to be approved by a vote of Parliament, including other parties. It could only last at most for 30 days. But even within that, at any time, if a majority of MPs had voted to revoke it or to revoke any part of it, any measure that had been put in place, they would all cease to apply. So it's extremely measured by international standards. What happened was the police, having been given the signal, I think this was as much as anything, was a signaling device that the feds were saying, we're fed up with this. This has gone on too long. This has to act. One of the things it did allow was bringing together police forces from across the country who would otherwise have all had to be sworn in under some very obtuse bureaucratic procedure, would have taken days. Under the Emergencies Act, they were able to be put together under one command. They went in and cleared out the convoy in Ottawa in a remarkable display of restraint. People were, again, we're living the social media age. People were trying to pick clips up and make them out into something horrible. The sum total of what happened that might be called violence or anything in that was a few people got pepper sprayed who were particularly close to police lines. One or two people got kneed in the back as they were resisting arrest. That was about it. Most of the people who were arrested, protesters who were arrested, were basically let off at the other side of town. The only people, to my knowledge, who are in jail right now are, I think, 3 of the protest leaders. The most contentious thing was a measure that allowed the banks to freeze, not seize, but freeze the assets, the bank accounts of people who were directly involved in the protests. There's been claims that other people who were just donating to it have been caught up on this, but no evidence of that has been produced. And anybody whose assets were frozen or bank accounts were frozen, they were unfrozen a couple of days later. So that's the state of emergency. That's the terrible imposition on civil liberties that people have blown up into this terrible thing. There are legitimate debates as to whether this act, whether the tests outlined in the act had actually been met that allowed it to be invoked. And someday a court is going to pronounce on that. And I don't think anybody wants to see this as a precedent. We don't want to see governments invoking the Emergencies Act for every minor disturbance. And there will be, again, mandated in the act, an inquiry, a public inquiry that has to go look into how did this happen? Why weren't the police able to establish order in the normal course of things? Were the proper tests applied, and did this pass the test? All those questions will and should be addressed, and we hope that, I think everybody hopes that it will never come to this again, and we'll never have to invoke the Emergencies Act, hopefully ever, but certainly not for something like this again, that in any future similar type of disturbance, the police will be able to deal with it in the normal course of events. I think part of that has to be that there needs to be a political consensus that blockades of this kind whatever your cause, are not a legitimate way of advancing your cause. And we've had before this in recent history, just before the pandemic, 2 years ago, we had indigenous protesters blocking railway lines and causing havoc in the country. And while they certainly had a much more legitimate cause than whatever was the cause for the Ottawa protesters, I think there has to be a consensus that kind of thing is not an acceptable. Doesn't mean any measures are justified in breaking it up, but that we have to have a consensus as a society that we're going to have, that the rule of law is going to apply, and that protests have to be not just peaceful, but can't be massively disruptive to the life of the country. And so I hope that is also one of the lessons that we draw coming out of this.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Álvaro, you've been waiting patiently. Thank you. You mentioned earlier in your comments that some of the tweets that you had gotten back, or the comments on some of your pronouncements. We have been tweeted at, for example, by a very high-ranking official in the Colombian government. Essentially, as far as we can make out what the tweet was, saying, "Oh, you see, after Canada invoked the Emergencies Act, that in Colombia we agree with you," and somehow trying to equate that with the way the ESMAD or the police in Colombia have been dealing with the protests in Colombia. That's just one example. Others, you've heard this as well. You're sitting in Ottawa. You know the Emergencies Act. Does the Emergencies Act or the application of it sound like something that Nicolas Maduro would do, or something that somebody else could use to justify heavy-handed, might we say, police interventions?
I mean, I just wanna. That's a great question. I just want to preface that just by building up on some of the points that Judy and Andrew have made. And there was a lot of comment, particularly on the right, in terms of how this protest is about free speech or freedom of expression, and how, etc., and so on and so on and so forth. And alternatively, how during the heyday of the protest of the incumbent, the protesters were being subjected to things akin to a police state. And I just want to mention to our Latin American audience, right, the fact that encampment that Judy was mentioning in Coventry Road is right across one of the RCMP's headquarters. The RCMP is the Federal Police Service of Canada. So imagine that happening in any authoritarian country in Latin America, right? Like, that's just unfathomable. Like a protest like Maduro, if there was a protest outside of the SEBIN, right, the Bolivarian Intelligence Service, or the Helicoide, which is one of the other seats of the security services, that would be absolutely, it wouldn't be let run free for like 3-4 weeks, right? Like without any sort of consequences. So it's completely ridiculous to equate either the police handling of the protest during the actual protest, or the invocation of the Emergencies Act, an act that was passed by the Conservative government of Brian Mulroney here in Canada. So it was not passed by Trudeau's party, just to put it simply. That it's completely, it's a very mal-intentioned type of comparison. And coming from people in Latin America, having experienced authoritarianism of all political signs, right? Like, the latest iteration of this has been on the left, right? In Nicaragua, most recently in Venezuela, Cuba, but of heavy-handed military interventions, dictatorships during the right wing, often during the 70s and 80s. Like, to compare, as I have seen some kind of alternative media saying that Trudeau's government is a dictatorship, and this being tweeted to hundreds of thousands of followers in Latin America, and being retweeted, another, it just does a tremendous damage to political discourse, I think, in addition to being absolutely fact-free. But I think that it doesn't do any good to creating an actually facts-based, nuanced political conversation about some of the very important issues that, that if you want to talk about some of the underlying issues, whether it's, the right to protest and its limits, the state's role in enacting health measures, etc., that type of comparison and bombastic pronouncements, actually, I think, at the end of the day, they end up creating kind of like a doom spiral that goes nowhere, and that it's tremendously toxic. And that I am very concerned about, the tenor that some of these conversations have taken, because I mean, Canada perhaps is still a little bit of an exceptional in that sense, but we have very important elections this year in Latin America, in Colombia, and in Brazil. For our Canadian audience, right, Brazil is basically the United States of South America in terms of size, importance, right? And it's very important that those elections are carried out peacefully, that we have democratic transition, like a democratic transition in Brazil in case Bolsonaro loses, for instance. And we see Bolsonaro during this last year with January the 6th, with his support for the convoy, basically setting up his case to plea electoral fraud. Again, a fact-free, kind of like the election fraud claims were absolutely were absolutely fact-free, kind of like the criticism of the measures was absolutely fact-free. Like we have that danger in Latin America's largest democracy, that that has endured a lot of challenges, but has been quite successful, considering that it's been a democracy for 30 years, more than 30 years now. It's the longest running sort of democratic period in its history. So I would encourage everyone to keep an eye out for that, and and to try to in whatever way that we can to infuse facts and sort of like level-headedness into what could be a very dangerous, I think, year for Brazil.
Thanks, Álvaro. Just as an announcement, we've done many events and will continue to do so on the Colombian elections, and are going to be ramping up our coverage also of the Brazilian elections this year. So that's the commercial announcement. I want to talk a bit about Canadian political parties, particularly the Conservative Party, a bit of as a tipping point. I wasn't sure that was the exact word you used, Andrew, in one of your columns, but the sort of, are they going to go on the MAGA side, or are they going to remain as to what people might have imagined the Republican Party was pre-MAGA? But before I do that, Andrew, Judy, you've been listening for a while on this. I wanted to ask you first if you had any comments on what you've heard up till now over the last several minutes, and also what is the state of the convoy now? Is it just in a bit of remission, or is it on standby waiting to be reactivated again?
In regards to our viewers from Latin America, one of the things that I want to impress is that the constitutional right to protest was respected in this case for more than 3 weeks. This was technically an illegal protest to begin with. There were no permits that were ever issued in Ottawa. Usually you apply for a permit and then you protest. This was a protest in which thousands of individuals took up public space, started building structures in publicly owned land. They were having open bonfires, they were doing fireworks, and they were honking, as well as holding and harassing residents captive in their own homes. So the rights of protesters were respected and given too much leeway. What was not respected in this case was the concerns of residents and for their safety. And what police had failed there was to protect the safety of the Ottawa residents. What they did was uphold the protesters' right to demonstrate, to occupy the city streets. I would say that right now, that because the main organizers have all been have either been charged or released from jail or awaiting bail, the movement is deflated. It is rudderless in a sense. There are 3 encampments outside the city within a 30 minutes to 1 hour driving distance from downtown Ottawa. But it's what is their game plan? What are they going to do? Restrictions are being lifted as they were always intended to be, with the spring, with warming weather, with COVID cases being driven down. So what is their goal now? I think that there is an element of individuals who feel that they came very close and they may try again. But I think, and I would hope that we have learned from that. And in terms of accountability, I think we need to also look, we've been focusing a lot on local police, but we should also look at the provincial government as well as the federal government, because you mentioned the Ambassador Bridge, and it wasn't until the convoy protests spread to other parts of Canada, to border crossings, in which it was disrupting billions of dollars in trade, that people actually started to take notice, that the Premier issued on February 11th a state of emergency because of what was happening at the Ambassador Bridge. President Biden on that same day called Prime Minister Trudeau to end and ask him to do all he could to end the blockade, and offered the help of a Homeland Security. So it wasn't until billions of dollars in trade was impacted did the province and the federal government start paying proper attention to what was going on in Ottawa itself. And that's why the residents felt abandoned, because when someone is this close, literally a 5-minute walk from your doorstep, when you have the seat of power in Canada, you would expect those leaders to advocate for you, to support you, to help you. And that didn't happen for more than 3 weeks.
Thank you, Judy. Andrew, brings us back to you. I think it's fair to say that in the spectrum of Canadian columnists, you would be perhaps a little bit more conservative than others. Yet you have been the most alarmed, or certainly in print, most concerned about the direction of the Conservative Party in Canada. A bit of as I said earlier, a bit of a tipping point, which is an interesting. It's going to be an interesting experience for Canada, and maybe also an interesting experience for the world to see how a Conservative Party is going to respond to these kinds of forces. Do you want to talk a little bit about your concerns and where you think that might be affecting Canada?
Yeah, well, some of the same forces that are present in the United States and in other countries are present in Canada. There is this class divide. Or it's a class divided, defined not by money or birth, but by culture. You're really what you have, what they call cultural capital, the highly educated versus the less educated, people in metropolitan areas versus people outside those areas. All these things swim together into this kind of divide, and where it becomes particularly toxic is when it becomes associated with whether you trust or do not trust scientists or experts or authorities of any kind, because then it becomes a war about knowledge. Then it becomes a war about, is there such a thing as subjective facts, or at least shared facts, shared understandings? And as we've seen in other countries, and particularly in the United States, that can become extraordinarily debilitating for democratic discourse. So these forces exist in Canada. I don't think they're nearly as large as they are in the United States, or as intense. Partly because we haven't gone through the same series of traumas that the United States has gone to anything like the same extent, the kinds of things that have really sown distrust in authority in the United States. But they are here, and there's no doubt that some small c, large c conservative politicians would like to exploit that. Nobody has gone, with one exception, nobody has gone as far as Donald Trump or the types of people around him. The exception is a fellow named Maxime Bernier, who was formerly a member of the Conservative Party, Conservative cabinet minister, not, I would say, greatly respected, but he was certainly an interesting figure, and for most of his career, a relatively mainstream figure, but who left the Conservative Party and started a party called the People's Party of Canada, and has grown increasingly extreme in his rhetoric and positions ever since. And while while that would usually marginalize somebody in Canadian politics, and until recently he was not much of a force, the pandemic and the opposition amongst a certain section of the population to vaccine mandates and other public health measures gave him a bit of a lift. And I will say, I think the politicization of the issue by the Prime Minister during the last election and subsequently of making vaccine mandates a quote unquote wedge issue, exaggerating its importance beyond its actual importance as a policy in order to kind of sow divisions on the right, I think has also contributed to that. It's when you're pushing on the nerve ending of people who are pretty paranoid to begin with, you should not be surprised to see these kinds of explosions coming up. Anyway, there is a divide now in the Conservative Party between the types of politicians who would like to ride this whirlwind, who would like to exploit these sentiments, best represented by Pierre Poilievre, who has announced his candidacy for leadership of the party, and those who want nothing to do with that and would like to continue in the mainstream democratic traditions of Canada. It's sometimes presented as being a right versus left or right versus center debate, and to some extent it is that, but I think this is far beyond ideology. I think this has much more to do with, frankly, character and judgment, and whether you want to participate in a healthy democracy or not. So people can have robustly conservative views and be appalled and aghast at what's been going on in Ottawa. The leadership race is going to be a test, a battle for the soul of the Conservative Party, as it's sometimes said. And often that's said in exaggerated terms. I think it actually applies in this case. It looks like Jean Charest, who is a former Conservative cabinet minister, a former premier of Quebec, is probably going to enter the race. He will be probably the most formidable candidate against Poilievre, but it'll be an uphill fight. Poilievre has a lot of support within the grassroots of the party. And I think some of these issues around what kind of democracy are we going to be, what are going to be the rules of the game, what kinds of messages can be put out, to what extent are we going to stick with fact-based reasoning and democratic dialogue. I think if that's not going to be front and center of the debate, I think it's certainly going to be part of it. And more broadly, is the Conservative Party going to devolve into a much more populist Trump-style party, or will it remain more a small C conservative party with more a traditional Canadian conservative brand on it? I think that's a huge fight that's going to be had now within the party.
Just a quick follow-up on that before I go to Álvaro. So if in fact Poilievre, who has been all in on the convoy, support of the truckers, and folks and his supporters, if in fact he were to win, because the vote won't be too far in the distance now, what should the world understand about what that says about the state of Canadian politics?
I wouldn't rush to conclusions, because I'm not sure that's going to be a great strategy for them. For the reasons I was saying, I don't think there's the same size of audience in Canada for that as there is in other countries. Maybe I'll be proven wrong. But the Conservatives have been dabbling with populism in different ways for several, for a couple of decades now, and it hasn't done them a lot of good. The sort of setup of Canadian politics, partly because of regional divisions and the degree of urbanization of our country, et cetera, you can't put together a winning majority, I don't think, with that kind of message. So I think this is mostly, if they do go with Poilievre, I think they're going to, it's going to drive them further and further away from power. Sometimes people have a tendency to be complacent in this country. We think things can't happen here that happen in other countries. So I'm mindful of that as I'm saying this, but I don't think we should be so paralyzed by that idea as not to be able to say, I don't think this is going to fly in Canada, and I think there's evidence to prove that.
Thank you very much. Álvaro, I give you the honor of the last. I'm cognizant that we're a minute or two over time, but I definitely want to get your opinion on what should Latin America or even the world take away from the Canadian experience in dealing with the truckers' convoy, not just how they've dealt with it, but the kinds of alarm bells or warning bells or red flags, whatever, that have been raised. And What's your view about that?
Well, I mean, I think that first of all, there should be a kind of concerted effort to kind of clarify what exactly what Judy was saying, what Andrew was saying on the international stage on the part of Canadians, right? It's incumbent on us in some ways, on us, include myself, people who are here, to actually clarify, right, the degree, exactly what Andrew and Judy said, right, the degree of respect to freedom of expression that exists on this country, the fact that there's no police state, that the Emergencies Act is a parliamentary measure subject to tremendous debate, etc. And I think that message should be made. Of course, it's a less soundbitey message than hashtag free on convoy or whatever, but there should be some effort that, you know, if this is the terms in which the conversation are happening, well, there should be some creative effort on the part of people who actually care about, you know, liberal democracy, small d and small l, in terms of actually defending it, right? So I think that's very important. And then on the other end, I think that the convoy itself and the energy that was ostensible, right? Like I was on the road on the first weekend driving on 417, right, between Montreal and Ottawa, and there was a lot of energy, and as Judy was also saying, right? And so, and as Andrew was saying about the battle for the soul of the Conservative Party. So I think that is actually a sign of, well, like, you know, that many countries, including many countries in Latin America, are going through what some political scientists are calling, like, you know, a great realignment, right, or a big resorting of political coalitions, and that there's a lot of dynamism and flux. And people who perhaps a couple of years ago may have been on the far left in many ways, you know, with some of the very same anti-globalization, anti-big pharma, anti-government even, right, may now cross over and vote for the People's Party, for instance, you know, like with the Bernier's People's Party, or for other, you know, other types of, you know, farther right fringe political movements. I think that political institutions have a big role to play, and because of the Canada's electoral system and the type of dynamics that Andrew was saying, perhaps there is a degree of, you know, inoculation in some ways against fringe movements becoming kingmakers. But we have seen in other systems, certainly in Spain, for instance, and in potentially in other Latin American countries that have, you know, PR and other types of representation, how you know, relatively small parties that do not represent the majoritarian views actually can co-opt, you know, governments and become kingmakers. So I would be very attuned to that, and I would urge leadership in Canada and Latin America to start thinking also about institutional innovation, right? Like some of the things that the convoy, like this is something that British political scientist David Runciman has repeated time and time again, and big fan of this, is like liberal democracies are hitting kind of like a wall of institutional innovation, and there's need to be some rethinking needs to be made in terms of like how our systems work to better process dissent and to whatever that dissent is, and to avoid the type of disaffection that Andrew was expressing, which ultimately is tremendously dangerous for the systems themselves.
Thank you, Álvaro, and thank you, Judy. Thank you, Andrew. Once again, it pains me to cut off the conversation. We really don't want to abuse people and the time that they've allotted for this. So we must bring this to a close. I thank Bob Ramsey again and Ramsey Talk for being such a great partner in this event. I invite everybody to view the video of this event, which will be in English and Spanish on our YouTube page. You can see our website at www.ccacanada.com. We have many more events coming up, including the 13th episode of our series, Looking for the Political Center in Colombia, which we've been doing for more than 19 months. Not sure we found it yet. And many other events, as we said, on Brazil, Mexico, and other countries. So with that, thank you, Gloria Mejia, our wonderful interpreter. We look forward to seeing you back again shortly for our next event. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.